mute if you're not talking to the group. That would be great. And so again, this session is dedicated to the memory of Richard Gedold's mother. Okay, so we're in a new book. Wow, that's exciting. Yikra. Such a great book, right? All about sacrifices, offerings, purity, impurity, some ethical moral laws, really kind of intense book. And we've lost, for the most part, all narrative. But it is the centerpiece of the Torah. It's the heart of the Torah, and I think there's a reason for that. Some of which we'll see in our study, but it centers God's presence, and it's a book of instruction about how to maintain God's presence amongst us, right, through all kinds of ways. Purity, impurity doesn't go with holiness. So somehow that has to be navigated and mediated so one can approach the altar. So that's an example. Immorality also doesn't go with holiness. All right, so what we're going to do today specifically is ask the question of, what are sacrifices? Why are we sacrificing? Who are we sacrificing? Those kinds of questions that, the sages over the ages, I like that, the sages over the ages, have really transformed and transmuted the idea of sacrifice. So I want to get into sort of, some verses from Vayikra, and then we'll go into some notions of like God's presence and why we might be sacrificing to God's presence. Source sheet is coming. Caroline, can you share the source sheet? Share the source sheet. Okay, so let's say the bracha over Torah study. Thank you, Caroline. In cacophony, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen. It's a little cold in here, right? Luckily, there's some hot coffee. Here. People see that? Okay. Why can't I make this full screen? Okay, so again, Vayikra, the third book, the priestly book. And here we are at the beginning of the book. And I'm sorry. This is not we're doing a preamble first. So we're starting in Exodus. So here's the question that the people present in Exodus. After they grumble about water, and Moshe's instructed this time, early on in the wilderness history, to actually hit the rock and get water. And what we're told at the end of that episode is, Vayikra Shem Hamakom Masat U'Meriva. The place was named Masat Meriva. Why? Al Riv B'nai Israel, on the quarrel of the Israelites, or the children of Israel, Va'al Nasota et Adonai, because they tried Adonai or tested Adonai, saying, Leimor Hayesh Adonai B'Kirbeinu Im Ayin. Is Adonai present among us or not? What a great question, right? We could echo that question right now. Is God amongst us or not? And, I often say this, so forgive me if you've heard me say this, which you probably have. The general problem of the Israelites was not that they couldn't find God, but that God's presence was overwhelming for them. And they were terrified of God's presence, right? Like after Sinai, for instance, when they said, like, Moses, don't let God speak to us anymore because we're going to die, right? And God appeared to them as a consuming fire. And that contrasts with our issue, which is, where is God? What is God? Hold on one second. Let me just do a preamble, and then I'm going to call on people. But here, right, here it's a very well articulated question. Is God amongst us or not? So when they were needy, when they didn't have manna, or they didn't have, food, or they didn't have water, they became all anxious and felt abandoned and wanted to go back to Egypt, right? So this is one of those moments of experiencing abandonment and that anxiety in the face of their needs. Okay. God's presence is a changeable thing in the sense that Moses sees it differently, the Israelites see it differently, and at some point God wants to end the relationship with the Israelites in the face of the golden calf, and at other points, like after the spies. And here Moses is trying to repair that relationship and insist on God's presence, right? So again, Leviticus is all about God's presence. So I'm just kind of doing a little preamble to show the centrality of God's presence and how kind of tentative it is, right? Or tenuous it is. It could go like that. Okay. So let's look at this. So here's an experience of the children of Israel with the pillar of cloud in front of the tent of meeting. When all the people saw the pillar of cloud poised at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise and bow low at the entrance of each tent. So you get a sense of this is an awesome collective experience. And then we go to the intimacy between God and Moshe. V'daber Adonai al Moshe, panim el panim, kasher yidaber ish el re'ehu. And God would speak to Moses both face to face, as one person speaks to another, or speaks to their re'ehu, their beloved, or their friend. V'shav el hamachaneh u'misharto Yehoshua ben Nun na'ar lo yamish mitocha. Then he would return to the camp. But his attendant, Joshua, son of Nun, serving as deputy, would not stir out of the tent. So what I should have said is this is right after the sin of the golden calf, and that this is in the face of, again, God threatening to sort of, withdraw God's presence, or to end this enterprise with God's people. 12. Vayomer Moshe el Adonai re'eh. So here's the conversation between God and Moses. Ata omer elai ha'al ta'am hazeh v'ata lo hodatani et asher tishlach imi. V'ata amarta yidaticha b'shem v'gam matzata chen be'enai. And Moses said to Adonai, see, you say to me, lead these people forward, but you have not made known to me whom you will send with me. Further, you have said, I've singled you out by name, and you have indeed gained my favor. 13. Va'ata im na matzati chen be'enecha, hodi eini na etrachecha, ve'eda achav lema'an emsa chen be'enecha, re'eh ki amcha hagoy hazeh. Now, if you have truly gained your favor, pray, let me know your ways, that I may know you and continue in your favor. Consider, too, that this nation is your people. So you can feel Moshe sort of making an argument, right? Moshe sort of wants more intimacy with God, more connection with God, and assurance that God will go along with God's people. 14. Vayomar. Panai yelechu v'hanichoti la. I will go in the lead, and I will lighten your burden. I'm not sure that's the only translation. Maybe, and I will be gracious to you. If anyone has a sense of how else that might be translated, just put it in the chat for now. Vayomer elav. So God says to Moshe, okay, my presence or my face is going to go with you. And then Moshe says, Vayomer elav im ein panecha hochim al ta'aleinu mizeh. If your presence doesn't go with us, or if your face doesn't go with us, don't take us up from here. But didn't God just assure Moshe that his presence was going with them? And Moshe is sort of that insecure about this connection between Moses' people and God. And then Moshe continues to say in verse 16, Uvamet yivada efo kimatzati chen be'enecha ani va'amecha halo b'lechtecha imanu v'niflinu ani va'amcha mikol am asher al pnei adama. For how shall we know that your people have gained your favor unless you go with us, that we may be distinguished, your people and I, from every people on the face of the earth? So Moshe again and again is insisting on this relationship between God and, again, Moshe's people and God's people. Okay, so let's see what God says. And God says to Moses, also this thing that you just said, I will do. Because you have found favor in my eyes. And I will know you by your name, right? So again, there's a concession here to intimacy. And then Moshe says he's even asking for more, right? Vayomer har'eni na ekvodecha. And Moshe says, oh God, let me behold your presence, or your kavod, your weightiness, your glory. So I mean, this is such a beautiful model of like just sort of insisting on intimacy and asking for more, and that vulnerability and that courage that it takes to do that, right? Again and again, what assurance do I have? Okay, show me your glory. So, 19, Vayomer ani avir kol tuvi al panecha, v'karati b'shem Adonai l'panecha, v'chanoti et asher achon, v'yichamti et asher alachem. 19. And God answered, I will make all my goodness pass before you. Or, it can also be translated, all my stuff, right, will go before your face. So again, you see all the iterations of face are highlighted there on the screen. And I will proclaim before you the name Adonai and the grace that I grant and the compassion that I show. Vayomer. So this is the caveat. Vayomer lo tuchal le'ot epanai. But you can't see my face, right? Why? Kilo yorani ha'adam b'chai. For a human being may not see me and live. So Moshe, you've gone really far here, but you've also gone too far, right? Right? There's a limit to this connection with face or presence that Moshe wants, because you can't be a mortal and see God's face and live. Vayomer Adonai, but then God gives a beautiful concession. Vayomer Adonai, hine makom uti. God says, behold, there's a place with me here. V'nitzavta al hatzor. Stand here on the rock, or station yourself on the rock. V'haya ba'avor kvodi v'samticha b'nikvat hatzor. And as my presence passes by, so as my glory, actually kvodi, my weightiness, passes by, I will put you in a cleft to the rock. V'samticha b'nikvat hatzor. That's so. Vasakoti chapai alecha, and shield you with my hand ad ovri, until I pass by. So there's something about presence here that Moshe is begging for that is essential to the survival and thrival, right? Thriving of the Jewish people, and yet to get too close to that presence is dangerous, which is really at the heart of Leviticus. You want to be in connection to that presence, but if you do the wrong thing, you get zapped, like the sons of Aaron. V'hasiroti et kapai v'ra'iti et achorai. I will take my hand away, you'll see my back. Ufanai lo yera'u. But my face must not be seen. So let me just repeat. Again, the reason we're doing this now is I want to consider what it means to live with God's presence. And Moshe sort of wanting more and more, and the people wanting less. And somehow through the Mishkan, that less and more is navigated by Moshe's exposure to the divine and the people's lesser exposure to the divine. It's like a very specific response to who the people are. Okay, so now I'm going to take some questions, and then we're going to open Vayikra. Let me stop my share and see if there are any comments or questions online. I don't see any yet. I know Tony was waiting.
So one of the more awesome Jubu poets of the 20th century, not as well known as Leonard Cohen, is a guy named Frederick Morgan.
I've never heard of him. That's because he's lesser known, not as
He's
much as
lesser
Leonard
known.
Cohen. I've heard of Leonard Cohen.
You know, if you knew your poetry well, you might know him more or less, and that's the
Oh, wow.
play on our thing. More or less, like what we're talking about here.
Okay, go on, yeah.
His last line of an amazing poem is God speaking from the whirlwind and saying, "It is a mistake to cling to me, but a blessing to find." And Moses is trying to cling to him, which is a big mistake.
Hey, sorry, could you potentially move closer to the mic nearby Rabbi Diane, because we're getting some,
Got
yeah.
it. So Tony's reading this as Moshe trying to cling to God. So that's interesting, because I also hear some anxiety. I don't hear clinging, but
Anxiety,
it's interesting that you hear that.
clinging. I mean,
I hear that.
let go and let God, man.
Let go and let God.
Let go and let God.
Okay, name of poet again is, I think,
Frederick Morgan,
Frederick Morgan.
Morgan. I'll send you
I
the.
just got a C in Tony's class.
No, you have a straight A in my class because I'm an easy grader, but also because you're an awesome rabbi.
Let's go on. Any other comments at this moment or questions? Yeah, Ezra. Oh, Ezra, yeah, speak loudly. Do that even better. Thank you.
I think let go and let God would be inaccurate in this because
Would be inaccurate.
yeah, specifically because
Unfortunately.
Adonai says that he's going to change his plans specifically because Moses asked.
Ah.
And I
So what
think that's
Moses
the
did
most
was
shocking
effective.
part.
Wait, Tony, wait. Finish Ezra's comment.
I think that's the most shocking part of like the entirety of Exodus, to be honest with you.
The most shocking part is that God actually changes God's mind.
That's
Yes.
correct.
Right? Through the intervention, right,
Yeah.
of Moshe and other prophets. Amazing. Okay, so Tony, let me just,
I got a D.
for the record,
I got a D in Ezra's class.
for the record, Tony stands corrected. For the record, everyone write it down. No, don't, it's Shabbos, Mark.
Make sure I understand.
Wait, speaker. Yeah.
I just want to understand, I'm understanding this correctly. Is the Mishkan kind of the bridge between, is that the role it's serving?
Yes, it navigates the presence of God amidst the Israelites. It's sort of like the structure by which they can navigate God's presence safely and through a lot of sort of rituals. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Ronnie online. Ronnie in Riverdale.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat
I've always been mystified, and maybe you can answer this question. In the same passage, we're told God and Moshe hung out in the tent together, face to face, talking, as closely as any really close beings can be. And then at the end of the passage, God says, "But you cannot see my face and live." So how do rabbis interpret that?
Well, I'll tell you how I interpret it, and I'm a rabbi. There's two things I could say. One is when it comes to God, paradox speaks more loudly than anything else. That's one thing. And the next, I can resolve the paradox in the following way, if you want to go there.
Yes.
So it says he's speaking to Moshe as, as a neighbor or as a friend or as a beloved, and there's that sense, this amazing sense of intimacy, but the speaking is unlimited, but there are limits on the vision. You can't see my face and live. You can hear my voice and live. It's interesting because it's a play on the Israelites hearing God's voice and saying, we can't hear your voice and live. But it seems like you can because Moshe does. So I can go in either of those directions, and I'm sure there's rabbinic material that points out this tension, and I'll see what I can find for you, Ronnie. If you want an ancient rabbi as opposed to an okay. Okay. Anyone else in the room before I go on to Zoom? Aye. Okay, Beth. Beth, and then I'm going back to the, wait, up. Beth, Brenda, 2 quick comments, and I'm going back to the text.
Shabbat shalom.
So,
This is making me wonder if there are other senses of ours that are overwhelmed in the presence of God. We've got
Absolutely.
sight, we've got hearing. What about taste and touch? What about proprioception? I just wonder, do we have anything else in Tanakh that speaks to these other senses of ours in relationship to God? Tiberti.
I think that great question. I'm not sure exactly how to answer that at this moment, except that there's an overloaded sense moment. And in fact, Asher Chaim and I discussed this recently, when the people see the voices. Right, so that's real. At Sinai, they see the voices. It's like they couldn't hear anymore. The synesthesia at Sinai. Thank you, Mark, for putting that so beautifully. Okay, so in terms of taste, when I hear taste, when I think of smell and the Torah, I think of God smelling the odors of the sacrifices. And when I think of taste, I only think of blessing. So I don't know. That's all I can say right now. Okay, Brenda, and then we're going on.
So this might be a stretch, but I'm thinking like symbolically, it might be like God goes past Moshe and he can see the backside. So it's like you can see the past, but you cannot see the future, which is, I think, what maybe the Israelites are longing for. Tell us what's going to happen. How are we going to be? How's this going to work?
Yeah,
And
Brenda,
God's
that's
saying, you don't know that. You can
yeah.
only see what's happened.
I think that's a beautiful interpretation. I've heard similar interpretations, so thank you. I think that's really evocative. Okay, I am going on. Here we go. We're going to get to the book that we're in now. God willing. Okay, here we go. Okay, so let's look, and I talked a little bit about this beginning of Vayikra last night, but let's go through it now. And we also talked a little bit about last week. So Vayikra, right? And it says in the translation, what? Vayikra el Moshe. Adonai called to Moshe. But there's no Adonai in the opening of Leviticus. It's just, and he called to Moshe. So it's interesting that the translation would have Adonai there, because it's definitely not in the Hebrew, right? And again, it just says, and he called to Moshe. And that, the missing subject or named subject for the verb, and the small aleph in manuscripts of the Torah and the scroll of the Torah, have led commentators to say over the generations that this is a moment of tzimtzum, of contraction for God, right? So that, it's a calling, and Moshe can sort of respond to it because of God's pulling back some of God's power. And if you remember at the end of Exodus, Moshe could not enter the tent of meeting. So that was like an expansion for God, and now God's pulling back, which is, I think, just a brilliant, both sort of moral and literary interpretation of the end of Exodus and the beginning of Leviticus. Then it says, Vayidaber Adonai elav, and God spoke to him, Me Ohel Moed, from the tent of meeting, saying, Lemor, saying. So in the beginning, in the first half of the pasuk, only Moshe is named. Only Moshe is named. In the second half of the pasuk, only God is named. So that's also interesting, right? I don't really have an interpretation for that. I'm just saying. But it's like, somehow maybe they're making room for each other. I don't know. But yeah, we've all been in relationships where we feel like there's no room for us, right? So this is like making space. Daber el b'nei Yisrael v'amarta alehem. Speak to the Israelite people and say to them. Okay, so now we have to really be careful, because the translation doesn't really get us to where we want to go, or at least where I want to go, and I'll tell you where that is in a minute. Adam ki yakriv mikem korban l'Adonai, min ha-behema, min ha-bakar, min ha-tzon, takrivu et korbanchem. Okay. So what it says here, what it says in the translation, actually, first I'll read the translation and then I'll tell you the crucial difference. Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when any of you presents an offering of cattle to Adonai, you shall choose your offering from the herd or from the flock. So the word that's missing for me in the translation is the translation of Adam. When any human wants to come close and bring a, what Everett Fox will translate as not sacrifice, but because of the root of the word yakriv and korban, a coming close offering. So a sacrifice is the mechanism, the korban is the mechanism by which we come close. Okay, wait. Wait, Asher Chaim just wrote a note. I just want to see if it's relevant to the translation. Comment on the ambiguity in the pronouns of the opening verse. Perhaps it accents how each party of the I thou is indeed reaching out. That's beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you so much. Okay. Oh, and I love what Mark said. Sorry, I'm just going back to the some of the chat. So in response to what Beth said, Mark wrote, that's why we're given a taste of honey when we're taught to read. The letters of Torah are sweet. That's beautiful. Talk about engaging our other senses. Okay, so now, so the human, when the human wants to come close, so it's fascinating in this book that's very particular, very particularistic. It's really about how the Israelites relate to God, right? But here it starts with being human, right? That's amazing. And I think it's a statement about being human in response to slavery, because in slavery, people can't be generous-hearted. They can't give. You know, maybe one of the tragedies of slavery and exploitation is that you're so limited, you actually can't give what you have to give. You have to serve someone else's ego, right? So here, it's like, oh, you want to come close? You want to offer? You want to sacrifice? You know, you're a human being who wants to do that, and here's the mechanism by which you can do it. And there's something else here that's really interesting. Ki yakriv mikem korban ladonai. So it starts off with the human being wanting to come close through the sacrifice, but it also says ki yakriv mikem. So, which can be translated as when you want to sacrifice from yourself or from yourselves, a sacrifice to Adonai. So what some of the Hasidic commentators say, right here, anyone who wants to become karov, close to God, must bring an offering mikem, that is from oneself. And what is the offering? Is the beast within ourselves, the part of ourselves that is capable of cruelty and brutality, even to those we love. So, but note that the Adam and the mikem are primary in this verse, and then the behema, the beast, and the cattle and the sheep are secondary. So it's really interesting locution, which sort of feels like it paves the way for later interpretations of what sacrifice is, which is to give of ourselves and give of our hearts, and give through prayer and study. And we'll see that in a minute. Because once the temple is destroyed, the rabbis had to figure out what to do with this temple-based religion and transmute sacrifice into different religious categories. And I know that many of us are uncomfortable with sacrifice and animal sacrifice, as we should be. And yet, there's something about giving something that's vital to yourself, you know, to the Creator that I think is instructive. Like, what are we giving? How, by what means are we coming close? And also the blood and the guts of it, I feel like, you know, are very evocative in terms of, you know, Judaism is more than a religion of the mind, right? It's also a religion of the blood and the guts. Okay, yes. Come close to a speaker, please. There's a speaker. Thank you, Wendy. You know what, can I just read one more verse and then you're on? Okay, so let me just finish this up. Im ola korbano min habakar zachar tamim yakrivenu el pedach olam ha'ed yakriv oto lirtzono lifnei Adonai. If your offering is a burnt offering from the herd, you shall make your offering on the altar without blemish. You shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting for acceptance in your behalf before Adonai. So that's also beautiful, a sense of like being able to offer and being accepted. Which reminds me of our little sanctuary song. Go ahead.
What I was going to say is that even here, there is a connection with the people and the animal, because God is requesting that the sacrifices be behemah, which are animals that are raised by human beings, as opposed to chaya, which are animals that are in the wild. So that if in fact the sacrifices were from animals that were chaya, wild, the people had no connection to them. But because they're domesticated animals, the people have a connection to them. So it's
That's interesting.
even that is
Yeah.
a little bit more than just a wild animal. Like this is an animal that the person
That I've raised and I'm keeping alive and I'm caring for.
Right. So
Yeah,
there is,
that's really
there
interesting.
is a little bit of a connection versus a wild animal.
Yeah, got it. Thank you, Wendy. Okay, let's look for a minute at the root of the word korban and lahakriv, to sacrifice. So this root, kuf resh vet, means to come near, approach, enter into, draw near, to be brought near, nif'al, to cause to approach, bring near, to cause to draw near, to bring near, bring present. So it's all about, again, we saw Moshe coming close to God, almost coming too close, right? And the people wondering where is God? Or at other points saying don't let God come close to us, literally. So here it's the korban is the mechanism by which the people approach God. And I think it makes sense. I know that sometimes people see this as oh, God's ego, what does God need all this stuff? But I think when you approach someone who has given you everything, you come bearing something. I think that's how human beings work. You show gratitude, you show a recognition of your greater limitations before that entity. Anyway, okay. Yeah, Jeremy.
I was always puzzled.
Okay, can you pass the speaker to Jeremy?
I was always puzzled by the fact that kufresh vet also means to fight and to do battle.
Oh yeah, krav.
And I don't understand how the two go together.
Oh, I have no idea. So that root also means battle. Kuf resh bet. I have no idea. A krav. So I have no idea how krav maga.
Oh, man.
War, battle, krav
War,
maga.
battle. So let's bookmark that question because I really want to understand that. And if someone knows, they might put it in the chat. Okay. Is there some connection? Okay, I'll get that in a second. Between a burnt sacrifice and the smoke that rises. No, I don't think so. That rises with a pillar of cloud. Don't create a cloud for Adonai to hide within. Those two things are separate, Mark. Okay, roof. It says roof. Kuf. Resh bet, also the root for relatives. Yeah, but that makes sense. Those who are close to you. Krav as battle, fighting was indeed close combat, Asher Chaim said, until relatively recent. And now it's distant combat, unfortunately, in many ways. Okay, Sarah. Sarah, could you come with your mom? Thank you.
Sure. And this is just an uninformed observation.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, for some of us, coming close is a huge struggle. It's a battle. And so perhaps there is the connection, that it is not easy ever to come close. And for certain people, it's a particular struggle.
I mean, intimacy is
Intimacy is a challenge.
absolutely, it remains a challenge.
Exactly.
God has intimacy issues, Mark is saying.
Yeah, particularly with an abstract entity.
Yeah.
At this moment, like God and the Israelites trying to forge a connection.
Yeah.
That's incredibly hard.
Yeah.
That's some type of battle.
Yeah, wow. You know what, while you're speaking, the image that's come to mind is Jacob wrestling with the angel, which was both intimacy and battle, right there. So I'm still interested in the question, but those are the beginnings of some answers. Okay, okay, I'm gonna look at, I pulled this thing in from Paul Ricoeur. I don't know if I'm saying his last name correctly. Anyone know? Tony's not here. Okay. Who has this notion of first naivete and second naivete. And I'll tell you why I brought it in a minute. Let me just ask someone, Jesse, would you read it, number 6? Because you're near a speaker.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay. Excuse me. Something has been lost. How do we do that? Irremediably lost. Immediacy of belief. But if we can no longer live the great symbolisms of the
Number
sacred
6.
in accordance with the original belief in them, we can, we modern people, aim at a second naivete in and through criticism.
So the reason I brought this in is that while studying the immediate details of sacrifice and thinking about how Judaism has transmuted those details in all kinds of ways to mean sort of offerings of study and mitzvot and prayer, then it seems to me that that's exactly what we're doing. It's like, you know, sacrifice doesn't work for us anymore. That's the first naivete, but we're in the midst of second naivete, which is sort of considering what those symbols mean and allowing them to become something else. Okay, and then here's an example of that from Avot de Rabbi Natan, which is commentary on the ethics of the fathers. Okay, so it starts off with a piece of the ethics of the fathers, and then it'll have commentary on that. Do you feel like reading this, Jeremy?
Sure.
Number 7.
Yeah, I'll just read it. I'm not sure we have it here.
It's number 4.
Number 4.
Oh, it's number 4 in there? Oh, that's weird.
Okay.
Thank you.
שמעון הצדיק היה משיירי אנשי כנסת הגדולה. הוא היה אומר, על 3 דברים העולם עומד, על התורה ועל העבודה ועל גמילות חסדים. על התורה כיצד? הרי הוא אומר, הושע ו', חסד חפצתי ולא זבח ודעת אלוהים מעולות.
Okay, let's stop there for a second. Okay, so translation. So Shimon the righteous was one of the last surviving members of the men of the great assembly who would say the world stands on 3 things. It's a very famous piece of Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers. What does it stand on? Torah, on the temple service, and on acts of kindness. So what's the proof text for the world sort of resting on the Torah? It's this verse from Hosea that says, I desire kindness, not a well-being offering, and the knowledge of God, which indicates to the rabbis that Hosea the prophet is talking about Torah, more than burnt offerings, more than olot. Okay, that's the first piece. Second piece, the Talmud Torah Chaviva. Next one, Jeremy.
Yeah, this is skipping, I'll just read it from the screen.
Oh, sorry.
בתלמוד תורה חביבה לפני המקום מעולות, לפי שאם אדם לומד תורה, יודע דעתו של מקום, שנאמר, משלי ב', אז תבין יראת אדוני ודעת אלוהים תמצא.
Okay, so another way to sort of put forward that Talmud Torah, learning Torah, is better than sacrifice, specifically olot, burnt offerings. Because if a person studies Torah, they know the will or the mind of God, the makom. And here's the proof text from Mishlei. Then you will understand the awe of the eternal, and you will discover the knowledge of God. Okay. Mikan. Sure.
מכאן לחכם שיושב ודורש בקהל, שמעלה עליו הכתוב, כאילו הקריב חלב ודם לגבי מזבח 2.
Oh, period.
Okay.
So from here we learn that when a sage sits and expounds before the congregation, Scripture considers it as if he brought fat and blood upon the altar. Amazing, right? So it's like studying Torah is that embodied, right? It's like you bring your guts to the table, literally. Yeah.
שני תלמידי חכמים שיושבים ועוסקים בתורה, ועברה לפניהם כלה או מטה של מת, אם בידן, כדי צורכן, אל יבטלו ממשנתן, ואם לא יעמדו
ואם לאו,
יעמדו וישנו, ויקלסו לכלה וילוו למת.
Okay, so this is an amazing little halacha, a little law. So if two Torah scholars are sitting and engaging in Torah study, and before them suddenly is a wedding, or a funeral procession, right? If the funeral procession or the wedding has enough people in them, right? They each need a minyan, then the Torah scholars should go on studying, and if not, they can join the processions.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah, very, very nice. Okay, I saw Richard Geduldig wanting to say something. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Oh, no, Richard Geduldig. Or maybe I got
Yeah.
did I get
Can you hear me?
mixed up? Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I was thinking this sort of business about sacrifice, not in personal terms. There are a lot of ways in which we may or may not sacrifice stuff. But in terms of the storyline, this comes at the beginning of 40 years in the desert, or near the beginning of 40 years in the desert. The Mishkan is constructed. It's working in the sense that God's cloud and fire are present when it moves or stays the same place. In a sense, the whole thing, and now comes all the sacrifice stuff and the priestly stuff.
Yeah.
The march itself, the stroll, the meandering through the desert for 38 years or however long it is itself an incredible sacrifice. It's like it makes sense that Vayikra should come at this point in the Torah, smack dab in the middle of the storyline, because it introduces us to the narrative of the primary part of the Exodus after Sinai, this wandering around and the sacrifices that occur during that long, long journey, including the lives of most of the Israelites. It's like the Israelites themselves are making the ultimate sacrifice. And in one sense, the literal sacrifices are a way of marking that through the march through the desert for 38 years.
That's really interesting, Richard. You're right. All the lives of the Israelites of that generation are offered up, so to speak, for the sake of the next generation entering the land. What is also interesting is that they actually spend a year at Sinai. Right? They're staying still in this whole book, right? It's like from Sinai till the end of this book is 1 year, and then in Numbers they start moving around again. So they're stationary, but you're right. They're ultimately will be sacrificed in some way. Okay, Richard Geduldig, did you have your hand up before too? Am I making that up? I got my Richards confused.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly what the other Richard said.
Okay.
Brief comment, Rob?
Yes, brief comment.
From the standpoint of our wish to have a permanent dwelling in this fleeting world,
yes,
walking for 40 years or whatever is a sacrifice. Otherwise, it's just a given. If we're not seeking some permanent shelter, it's just a given. That
yeah, but they
we're
also
wandering.
die in the desert and they never.
Well, by the way, death is also a given.
It is a given.
Come on.
Yeah. So,
First noble truth,
so you're
baby.
saying, Tony, yeah, you're saying there's something about the wilderness experience that
I'm
resonates.
saying this is a very bourgeois way to look at, from our bourgeois perspective.
Can I restate what you said?
Sacrifice.
I don't think the fear of death has anything to do with class.
Yes, my point, I rest my case. I rest my case, Your Honor. The Buddha's first noble truth
Okay, you
is
said
because
brief,
of death.
you're lying. We're done with you.
I'm a big fat liar, sorry.
Said brief, we're done. Okay, yes, there's something about the wilderness experience that resonates for all of us, for sure. Point well taken. Okay, I'm now going on, especially if people have said stuff already. I'm now going on with my text, and if you haven't said something, then I'd love to see your hand. Okay, let's see. Okay, Ramban. right? Nachmanides on Vayikra. Oh, that's soundtrack. Okay, nothing we can do about that. Does someone online want to read this? Anyone want to read this?
I'll
I'll
do it.
read it. I'll read it.
Okay, Ronnie, hit it.
Ramban on Vayikra 1:9. It is far more fitting to accept the reason for the offerings which scholars say, namely that since man's deeds are accomplished through thought, speech, and action, therefore God commanded that when man sins and brings an offering, he should lay his hands upon it in contrast to the evil deed committed. He should confess his sin verbally in contrast to his evil speech, and he should burn the instruments of thought and desire in the human being. He should burn the legs of the offering, since they correspond to the hands and feet of a person which do all his work. He should sprinkle the blood upon the altar, which is analogous to the blood of his body. He should sprinkle. My screen is jumping around here.
Oh, you're right, I'm sorry. I don't know why it looks so big like that. I have no idea.
He should sprinkle the blood upon the, which
I
is
don't know what's happening. Okay, go ahead. Now it should be okay.
He should sprinkle the blood upon the altar, which is analogous to the blood in his body. All these acts are performed in order that when they are done, a person should realize that he has sinned against God with his body and his soul, and that his blood should really be spilled and his body burned, were it not for the loving kindness of the Creator, who took from him a substitute and a ransom, namely this offering, so that its blood should be in the place of his blood, its life in place of his life, and that the chief limbs of the offering should be in place of the chief parts of his body. Wow.
I know. So it may be hard to connect.
That's funny.
I know it might be hard to connect to this, but the claim here is that all those animals that our ancestors were brought were exactly supposed to represent them, right? So the sacrifice is about like, if not for these animals, it's us that would be taken, right? Which again captures the danger of approaching God. Julie, you want to say something?
Nothing like interesting, but it's just like, at what point is it like punishment or justice or whatever, and at what point is it a sacrifice or a gift, right? Like this seems to pivot us away. This seems to pivot us away from like the offering part and more to the, we are offering ourselves some kind of justice or cleansing or
Yeah, that's
punishment
really interesting.
or evasion of punishment.
Right. So is this so I think there are some gift offerings,
Yeah.
right? And there are other offerings like sin offerings, which I think you're right. It's sort of capturing that sense that like there is no approach of God unless we do this. Like it's a necessity or a requirement. Hold on, I also see some people online. Hold on. Asha Chaim. Go ahead.
Thank you. The part I don't understand about Ramban is that Ramban seems to be talking about sin and atonement in the context of the Olah.
Yes.
And perhaps it's
Which is
because
the
perhaps because Ramban was in debate with Christianity for much of his professional life, and Christianity certainly stressed sacrifice for expiation of sin and the need for blood and the blood of the Savior and all of that. But in the actual wilderness experience, it seems that every animal to be eaten had to be brought to Ohel Moed as a sacrifice. And certainly the Olah has nothing in it that describes itself as being about sin, but rather the human desire to give something to God, completely give over something.
Something given totally, because it's totally burnt up.
And it might be the individual saying, I am small and unworthy, I give myself to God, but it's not explicitly about sin, in my very humble. knowing a tiny fraction of what Ramban knew, opinion.
I think that's really interesting. And I mean, the Olah incidentally expiated sins, even though it wasn't a sin offering. Right?
I'm sorry, what?
It incidentally purified one from sin, even though it's not a sin offering.
But it wasn't
There might have been Olah offerings in a context of sin, but that's not mentioned here.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Shh. Tony, I'm running this mess.
But you don't have the peripheral.
Tony spoke.
I also know Wendy's spoken already.
Excuse me, she and I are capable of having a conversation without a third party.
Okay, Tony. I'm totally on your side. Jeremy, did you have something to say?
I'll just say briefly, the previous speaker said that by sacrificing an animal, it's sort of in lieu of sacrificing ourselves. That's what I understood.
Yeah.
That's exactly.
Julia even said that.
Sorry, who said that?
Julia?
Yeah, Julia. That's exactly how I read Leviticus, which said, Adam ki yakriv korban mikem korban la'Adonai min ha've'ema. It's basically saying, humans, when you want to sacrifice from yourselves, take an animal. That's how I read it. That's
Right. And I think Julia's point is that maybe there's a coming close to God that doesn't, and I'm not sure what your point, that doesn't have to do with sin. It's not necessarily about justice and sin, but it's also about wanting to give ourselves.
Right, exactly.
So Ramban, as Asher Chaim was saying, goes in the direction of sin. Right, which is interesting. It might be related to his ongoing conversation with Christians throughout his lifetime. Okay, so I do want to go on. I know there's some burning comments, so I'm going to really ask people to be as concise as possible. Wendy, can you make a very quick comment? And then Ronnie, come to the speaker.
I agree with the Ramban in terms of a chatat.
One line. Can you do one line?
But not in terms of the other offerings.
I see what you're saying. Okay, got it. Sorry, I cut you off too prematurely. So in terms of the chatat, it would make sense that we're offering ourselves in sin and there's some correspondence to the animal and who we are. Okay.
But there are multiple other offerings that this
right, but he seems to be describing the Olah here. So yeah. Okay, Ronnie.
I have to read it as a rhetorical strategy that just allows for this whole business being a symbolic substitution.
Yes, I agree. So that all animals and all sacrifices is like a symbolic substitution for who we are, for ourselves. Okay, let's go to Genesis 22, talk about the command to sacrifice a child. I don't actually think we have to read it. I want to put it here just like, okay, yes, right? In Genesis, God actually commands that Abraham offer his own child. But then there's this amazing transformation when we get to Hannah, when we get to Hannah, who offers up her child, but in life and ministry. So let's look at that for a minute. Asher Chaim, do you feel like reading?
Sure.
1 Samuel, number 10.
V'hi marat nafesh, she was bitter of soul. Vatitpalel el Adonai uvachot tivkeh, she prayed to Yud-Heh Vav-Heh, and weeping she wept.
Okay, let's just remember why she's bitter of soul. So she's been barren all these years, and she has this co-wife, Penina, who's like giving birth and throwing it in her face that she has children and Hannah doesn't. So she's bitter of soul, and she finally comes to God to sort of try to shift the narrative.
Vatidor neder, she vowed a vow. Vatomar, and she said, Adonai Tzevaot, Yud-Heh Vav-Heh of the multitudes, Imra'ot tir'eh ba'oni amatecha, if seeing you see the anguish of your maidservant, Uzachartani velo tishkach et amatecha, and you remember me and do not forget your maidservant. ונתת לאמתך זרע אנשים. Give to your maidservant seed of humanity. Untativ ladonai kol yemei hayav. And I will give him to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh all the years of his life. Umorah lo ya'aleh al rosho. A razor shall not come upon his head. He will be a Nazirite. V'haya ki hirbeta litpaleh lifnei Adonai. And it happened as she was praying a lot before Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Eli shomer al piha. Eli was paying attention to her mouth. V'hana hi medaberet al libah. Hannah was speaking on her heart. Rak svateha na'ot v'kolah lo yishamea. Only her lips were moving, but her voice was not audible. Vayachshuveha Eli l'shikora. Eli thought she was intoxicated. Vayomer eleha Eli ad matai tishtakerin. Eli spoke to her and said, how long will you be intoxicated? Hasiri et yenech me'alayich. Remove your wine from upon you. Vata'an Hannah vatomer lo Adoni. Hannah replied and said, no, my lord. Ishak shat ruach anochi. I am a woman of hardened spirit. V'yain v'shechar lo shatiti. But I haven't consumed any wine or intoxicant. V'eshboch et nafshi lifnei Adonai. I pour out my soul in the presence of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Al titenet amatecha lifnei bat Belial. Don't present your maidservant as a worthless woman. Ki merov sihi v'cha'asi dibarti adhena. Because it's out of much language and outrage that I have spoken so far. Vayan Eli vayomer lechi leshalom. Eli replied and said, go towards peace, towards fulfillment. Ve'Elohei Yisrael yitain et shelatech asher sha'alt me'imo. May the God of Israel give or fulfill your request which you have asked from him. Vatomer timsasif shivcha hein b'einecha. And she said, may your maidservant find grace in your eyes. Vatelecha isha ledarkah vatochal. The woman went on her way and she ate. Ufaneh lo hayu lah od. Her face was no longer as it was.
Thank you, beautiful. So Hannah is the person upon whom the rabbis base their the laws specifically for the Amidah, right? For the sound staying before. In that she's like moving her lips but not speaking aloud. And you see that, you know, as opposed to, this is like really interesting to compare to the Akedah. In the Akedah, God commands the sacrifice of a child, and here she's, through prayer, offering up her child, which is a whole different thing. And then God responds to her prayer and actually gives her a child who will minister to the priest Eli, right? Shmuel, because God heard her. Okay, so I'm going to skip a little bit because I want to, there's two things I want to get to. I think this is an amazing, there's a poem and a passage that I really want to do before we end. So number 14, these are thoughts on Korbanot from Mark Kirschenbaum, who's actually, I think, a cancer doctor, a cancer researcher, who writes Divrei Torah, Torah commentary for Tikkun magazine, which I think maybe does not exist anymore. Right? Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, so number 14, it's long. I'm just thinking about how we should chop this up. Actually, let's have someone begin reading this. Eric, do you feel like it?
Okay.
Number 14? Just, Mara, can you move the speaker closer to Eric? Thank you.
Is that, Get rid of that little box there. Okay. The central teaching of the Korbanot Rite is that we must learn to not relate to our world in an exploitative manner in which everything around us exists purely there for our manipulative consumption and selfish enjoyment.
So that's interesting, right? He's saying that this is the teaching of the korbanot, or the sacrifices, right? That not everything is here for us. Not everything is here for our consumption, right? And if you think about it, I talked about this a little bit last night, there's something about korbanot which really reverses, one of the central sort of assumptions of our society, which is it's all about consumption. Okay.
We begin by transforming our relationship to God into one of the de-utilized, which we call the holy.
In other words, the things that are not for our pragmatic use, right? We go from using into sort of recognizing things for their intrinsic nature and being.
To use an example from Melanie Klein, we learn not to look at God as the good breast solely as the extension of our desires, which whom we are angry when we are hungry, becoming the bad breast. When we are infants, at an important point, we begin to learn that we too are separate, individuated beings, that our needs are within us, and the world is a much more complicated place than we imagined, where there are many individuals with many needs. This, in Kleinian child psychology, is an important step in individuation and in healthy relations with the parents. This process is reiterated somewhat in the Korbanot as we have interpreted them here. We learn to separate the holy from our exploitative purposes. We learn to communicate in such a manner by transforming our prayers in the same manner. Time becomes holy when we learn to live our Shabbat
this way. Sorry.
We are trained in recognizing sacred otherness in our spiritual lives. We have the capacity to recognize that every person has their own unique set of needs and drives. Their needs are not our needs, and we find ourselves living properly in community. A thought just hit me.
Yeah.
Perhaps this is what meant.
Oh, I thought you. Go ahead. Sorry.
Perhaps this is what is meant when Abraham is congratulated for not holding back his son from God at the Akedah. That Abraham reached the point where he truly allowed another living being to individuate. Thus, the true moment of atonement comes when one realizes that the world is not only narcissistically absorbed in one's own sins, etc., but rather when one realizes that we are part of a whole community of life, each with their own specific needs and desires, where the truest atonement is the recognition of the other's existence and autonomy. World events prove that this lesson is far from being actualized.
He wrote that in 2011, so even more so now. Okay, so I stopped my share to see if anyone wants to say anything before we go on. So we just read this one. We just read this one. No comments. So sacrifice as sort of training ground in recognizing that another is separate from us and has separate needs. Does that make sense? Does that work? Yeah, Tony likes it. Okay.
Pure boober, by the way.
Pure boober. Yeah, that sense of I thou and understanding that the other has a radically, is radically other. Thank you. Okay.
It's making me think a little. I mean, I'm still sort of making my way through.
They just put the.
We've lost the audio.
Yes.
Oh, it's right. Okay, thank you.
There we go. Okay.
As I understand him, he's saying, philosophy is about understanding, and Judaism is about revering. and yet man uses, exploits, which seems connected to what he's saying here. And then he says later that
But he's saying something about the holy sort of arises when we stop exploiting the other, or even other space, right? Like when do we reckon, or even time, right? We recognize the holy when we stop using it.
yes, and well, and then more, he says, and again, I'm just beginning to make my way through him, but the God in Search of Man. But then he says later that Kant sort of gave us the idea that God is in nature, but Judaism on some level sees God in everything. You know, so it seems to me like it's related to what Melanie Klein is suggesting in, you know, not using one another, which of course is also Buber, you know, but really holding each other in a holy way.
Yeah, and I like that he starts, or he does so by naming the mother. Like the most challenging thing is to see the person who fulfilled all our needs or didn't as a separate person. Right, that's where we need to begin. You know,
and that's the hardest thing.
And that's the hardest thing. Okay, Jamie, and then one more text before we go. Go ahead.
So we were talking about sacrifice and holiness, right? And what is sacred in our world now that we consider so holy, so precious to us, that we would be willing to forfeit our desires, our, well-being, our, all of the things that we wished for. We would be willing to give that up in service of something greater than ourselves. And I think,
what do we sacrifice for the greater good, for the collective?
Right.
Great question.
And at the end of services every day, we say that, and on that day, the earth will be as one. So when we embrace the idea that we are one, that we are a collective whole as humanity on the earth, breathing the same air, animated by the same being that created all of us, then that I think is the ultimate in, what, individuation as a collective. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Yeah, and the question is, what sacrifices do we need to make along the way to get there? It's a beautiful sort of.
I think the sacrifice is judgment. It's separation from other.
Thank you, Jamie. All right, one more incredible